Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about RackForms, really neat capabilities when it comes to generating full-page, multi-page PDF files, which we can then send an email, send along an FTP, send to a database, etc. So the critical thing to note about RackForms when it comes to PDF generation is that we kind of have two main ways that we can generate PDFs, or at least interact with them. The first is if you're a Windows user or you have a Linux distribution that has access to Java, we have a toolkit called PDFTK. And it's a popular open source project, at least for the server, which allows you to manipulate PDF files. And the general idea is if you have an original PDF file, so let's say like a 1040 form, you could generate a form in RackForms that would have field names that match the PDF forms field names. And then you would give RackForms that PDF file to basically say, when you submit this PDF, go ahead and match all of the input to the PDF original, and then generate that PDF original as a download or a something that you could email, again, send to a database, etc. The only downside to that process, as powerful as it is it unfortunately won't support things like images or dynamic blocks of content. So if you have a bucket repeater or you have a signature image, things like that, unfortunately we don't have the capability to script that against PDFTK. But that's okay because we have another way, and that's possibly a little bit more flexible, of doing that, and that's what we're going to look at in this video. So the basic idea is I have this 3-page document, which I have in Affinity Publisher right here, which is just really reflecting the idea that we have a sort of like a cover page and then 2 pages that would represent form content. And the idea here is this is a very basic form. Really what we're after here is just kind of showing the core features and workflow that you would need to do this. Obviously, anything you create is certainly going to look a lot more official than this. But the first step then in any one of these processes is we will need to generate image files for each one of the PDF pages that we want to create. And so that's what I've done here. I've basically taken this document and I've exported the first and second page as PNG files. And that's what we have right here. So these are going to become my 2 form pages. Now the target state that we're after here in the end is basically this. I have a form where I've collected some information, and then I have my template page. And basically the template page is going to go direct to the browser, and it's just going to convert the form input, which is a template, into a 2-page PDF that does things like includes our signature and has the dynamic values for, in this case, the name that I typed out. And the things that we're after here is that the image boundaries should be lining up nice and tightly here, and the placement of our dynamic elements should match closely, or exactly, of course, with where they should be on the form. So really what we're doing is templating. We're saying here is going to be a background image that represents, I'll kind of open this up quick so you can see it. This is going to be the background image that we're going to then lay things on top of. That's why we call it a template, is this doesn't have any of the user's content, it just has where the user's content should effectively display. So how do we do this in RackForms? Well, I'm going to go ahead and delete this page, and we're just going to start from scratch. So again, in this form, we've had a couple pages already where we've collected some information. So now we're at the step we're going to create our template page. So a template page in RackForms is really just a form page that is going to be enabled with PDF output that's either then going to go direct to the browser or save for one of our output methods. For example, again, saving to email, SFTP, database, etc. In this case, I'm just going to leave enable PDF output to yes, and let's just go ahead and rename this page to template, and let's see what happens when I run this page. So it is just going to display this sort of page, this single page, with the piece of content that I have. So sortable page header, sortable page header. So the first thing to note, of course, is that when you convert to PDF, PDF can be made to understand like very small, non-standard page sizes. But generally speaking, in RackForms, our PDF options, which we can reach by this guy right here, are going to essentially say, well, no, I want a letter. So my page size here is being set to letter. It's in portrait orientation. So therefore, that's what the PDF is going to be. So there is something that you need to kind of get used to right away, which is that there is a disconnect between what the editor is showing here, this very sort of squat short page, versus what the PDF is showing right here. And again, that's okay, because what we're after is to effectively add elements to this page so that it makes sense for a PDF, which is 8.5 by 11 in this case. So the first thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to note that the technique that we're after here is for every page in the PDF that we want, we're going to add a bucket. So in this case, I want 2 pages, so I'll just go ahead and add 2 buckets to this form straight away. So these are going to be my 2 pages. Then, critically, for every page that I have, and again, you may not have multiple pages. If you only have 1 page, you don't need this step. But if you do have multiple pages, for every one of the pages that I have, I'm going to go ahead and select my page. And under my PDF options right here, I'm going to go ahead and click this Add PDF Page Break to Page. And then where I want that page break to break, I'm just going to go ahead and drag it in between the 2 bucket items. So first though, let's just see what happens if I run this page without that. You can see here that it's a single page. It's blank, but that's to be expected because there's no content, but it is only 1 page. If, however, I bring in that bucket item right here, now when I run this, you'll notice that it is in fact a 2-page PDF. So that's sort of the first thing that we want to kind of get used to, is that when I want a page break, I add the page break item. Now, I added this, to be clear, by going to PDF and just clicking this little link right here, but you can save this item right here as just a snippet that you can very quickly access in prefabs right here, or excuse me, in field presets, because all it is just this code block that has under raw code a div. That's all this thing is. It's just a div that has a class, and this class tells the PDF engine that I want a page break where you find this element. So the next step that we want then is to populate this with our content. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select my bucket, and I'm going to click my image element right here, because again, after all, my document has these big, beautiful images in the background. So I'll make sure that my image is within my bucket. It is, and I'll just go ahead and drag that first image into my form. And what this is going to do is it's going to take that image and it's going to sort of blow up my form here for a second, because it is now obviously much bigger than my bucket. But what we're going to do is we're just going to simply drag this bucket's boundaries down now so that mostly encompasses my image. I do not have to be exact here. That's not the idea. We just want to be close. Now, of course, this is actually pretty wide, so I'm going to go ahead and say like 856 pixels, because I want to make sure that I see all my elements. And again, I don't even have to go to the very edge of this. I just want to be close so that I can drag elements on top of this when I'm doing my actual form population. Okay, so what happens now? So if I go ahead and run this form, you're going to notice now that there's a couple things that we need to take care of. So the first, of course, is this isn't lined up at the edges. That's okay because we haven't lined it up on the edges yet. But you may notice that there is a little bit of an outline right here. And that's because by default, RackForms does add a little bit of styling to images to make them a little bit nicer looking in forms. But we don't want that in the PDF, especially for background images. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this extra field style attributes. And now if I run this, you'll notice that that little border is gone. So that's good. However, we now have a second problem, which is that now our PDF has grown to many pages that don't quite make sense. You'll notice it is a 4-page PDF, even though we only have 1 page worth of content, and it should only have 2 pages total because we have 2 buckets. And the reason why that's happening is going to invoke a second little shortcut for us, which is, again, in the conversion process, PDF libraries are really, really picky. And so we need to just kind of tell using style sheets, the PDF engine, that no, we don't want you to start creating pages uncontrollably because you think that the layout is all broken. And we're going to actually do that very simply by just selecting the page. And once again, by going to PDF right here, we're just going to go ahead and apply full page CSS to page JavaScript CSS. And what this does is just adds this block to the page JavaScript CSS code section. And it's actually very simple. We're just going to add a style to HTML and to body so we don't have any margins. This will make doing the full page forms much cleaner. We're going to make sure that an internal element for doing positioning doesn't have any padding. That's important for sort of little, again, positioning, very subtle position elements. And then finally, to fix our bizarre issue with multiple pages, we're just going to go ahead and say that buckets now have a max height of this specific value. Now, this specific value works for 8.5 by 11. You might want to change this, of course, if you're doing 11 by 17, for example. But for 8.5 by 11, this is sort of the magic value. Now, when I run this form, you should see now that we're back down to 2 pages, as we expect, and each page contains exactly what we expect, which is an image on the first page and nothing on the second. So at this point now, really the only sort of last major component then is just populating that second page. So I'm actually going to move this guy a little bit closer right here. And we'll just go ahead and work on the second item. So I'm just going to go ahead and select the bucket. I'll add an image to this guy. And once again, for the image, I'll select the image I want to populate with. In this case, it's this page 2.1. And I'll do the same thing I did before. Our image is a little bit larger / a lot larger in the bucket. That's no problem. We'll just go ahead and once again move this bucket down here so that it encapsulates mostly closely, doesn't have to be exact again, with that image that we just drug in. And so now, if we run this form once again, we should see now that both of our pages have content. Again, we're going to get rid of that style real quick, but now we're ready to actually start adding elements on top of this. So first things first, I'm going to delete that extra style, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my bucket and add a body text element. So basically what we're going to do here now is we're going to kind of go from I have one big image that doesn't have any background information to we have an image, but it needs to layer stuff on top of it mode. And really the only difference here is that I can move both of these guys freely. It's just that these guys should probably have some content in there. And so for example, this body copy item, let's say that I want to display whatever the user entered as their name right here. If you've used RackForms before, you'll know that to do this, we use what we call tokens. And a token is usually just what are we grabbing from? In this case, it's going to be a form field. So it's going to be a capital F, and then the name of the field that we want, which is name. And so I'm just going to scroll down here. I'll select my item, and I'll just say capital F and the name of that form field. And what this is then going to do is it's going to make sure that we display that value in this block of text right here. Of course, we could do this with other things. For example, we could do this with checkboxes, select items, blocks of text. We could do it with repeaters. We can do it with signatures, etc. In this case, I'll keep it simple and just say that I want to display the user's name right where we have name. So go ahead and just position this guy generally where I want it. And once again, we should see when we build this form that if we scroll down to the second page, our alignment should be pretty good. Now there's one last thing that may actually be changed when you have a shipping version of this. We're still building this out. But unfortunately, again, during the conversion process, there's a few weird things that may happen. And one of those is that you'll notice we have a bit of a gap right here. And that's despite the fact that it looks like we're tied up against our bucket. And unfortunately, this is just one of the artifacts of, again, the conversion process. So for now, the fix here is just to move it up so that we go about 10 pixels higher, which is just 2 little clicks there that you saw, and now we're nicely tight right here. Of course, at this point, we moved our field elements a little bit, so we'll just reposition this 2 elements up as well. And finally, when we run the form, we should have the layout that we want right here. Again, very simple layout, but hopefully you get the idea. It's just a matter now of positioning items. One real quick hint I'll give on this positioning items logic right here is if I select my page, we have a neat option where we can actually change what we call the snap right here. So right now it's 10 pixels, which means that every time I move an element, it's going to move by 10 pixels. Of course, I could change this to 0 or 1, and this will effectively be infinite positioning ability. Don't usually recommend doing that because usually the 10 is a good default, but if you wanted to, you could get down there, and with single pixel precision, you can move elements around. So that is our look then at using RackForms to create PDF template pages that have background images and that are multiple pages. Any questions or comments, as we say, please reach out to us.